Good afternoon. Today I'm going to overview the changes to the standard of ISO 9001, 2015. These are the changes that were implemented as an upgrade to ISO 9001, 2008. The technical committee that's responsible for the ISO 9000 standard is TC 176. My name is Lisa Greenleaf, and I'm the operations manager of NSAI. My contact info is here on the first slide. The objectives of this webinar are to give you some background on the revision to the standard, talk about some of the significant changes that have been made to the standard, discuss some of the new terminology. I'll talk about the transition timelines, and then I'll go clause by clause with a detailed review of the standard, and then we'll wrap up and summarize. If you have any questions, please email them to me directly at lisa.greenleaf@nsai.inc.com. First, let's talk about some of the background on the standard and why it needed to change. Basically, the standard, as it was originally set up, was set up around manufacturing companies that typically produce a product. But in today's world, we have virtual companies. They exist in multiple countries, and there's a heavy focus on the use of electronic media. As the world changes and companies change, there needs to be both a consistent foundation for the future and a way to handle companies that don't traditionally manufacture products. Some of the benefits from the changes that were made is that the standard now it was done in a format that is consistent for all management system standards. So the 10-element structure is common across all multi-management system standards, as you'll see. It's set up in a way that's more efficient, so it allows you as a company to address multiple standards without having to have multiple systems set up, so you can have things overlap and integrate very nicely. It's standardized some of the core definitions, which we'll talk about, and the same thing with providing common terminology throughout the standards. And again, it gives you as a company flexibility so that you can address multiple management standards without having to have multiple different systems set up. It really takes a clear focus on the process approach. And although there was always a process approach in the 9000 standard, there's much more clarity definition given to it throughout the standard now. Let me talk about some of the significant changes. It's now a 10-clause structure. Now, that doesn't mean we just added 2 clauses to the 8-clause structure. There's actually been a change where a couple of the structures, the sections that were previously in the standard have been broken out into substructures, if you will, and it resulted in 10 clauses. Again, it's intended to be much more compatible with companies that offer services and aren't in a manufacturing environment. So a service company, a test laboratory, for example, service providers in general. It introduces this risk-based thinking approach, and it requires a clear understanding of the environment that you're operating in as a company or the context of your organization, which is one of the buzzword principles that we'll talk about. Preventive action, you'll hear, has gone away. It's not that it's gone. It's actually now addressed through risk, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. And the process approach of the standard has been strengthened. The term documented information replaces documented procedures and records. It's not that procedures and records have gone away. It's that you now have flexibility in the way that you present your information. It could be a procedure. It could be a record. It might be something else. It might take the form of something else. Throughout the standard, there are 22 references to documented information. So as an auditor, every time you see the words documented information, we're going to be looking for something that backs that up. Now, instead of having a purchasing section, it's called externally provided products and services. And the reason for this is that many companies outsource parts of their production process. As opposed to just purchasing raw materials, you're actually purchasing services as well. And so it expands the thinking here to address purchasing of services and outsourcing of processes, whereas in the previous standard, outsourcing was addressed as kind of a footnote to Section 4. There's an increased emphasis on looking for opportunities for improvement versus just the risks. And as I mentioned earlier, there's an integration of the different management systems into your overall business strategy and systems. So instead of thinking of this as a quality management system, it's really a business management system that, oh, by the way, as you integrate it, happens to meet the ISO standard. So it really should be more strategic and align with the company direction that you're already taking. There's much greater emphasis now on the customer and communications than there have been in the past. Annex SL is a new term. It is a term that was developed by ISO. So what is it? It is what gives that structure and gives the common clause headings and the core text. So having that core structure increases the alignment between standards so that you as a company can implement multiple management system standards with much more ease because now the different elements of the standards align. It gives you that generic core vocabulary for the management system standards across the board. It also recognizes that no two operations operate in the same exact way, so there's now greater flexibility in how you meet the requirements of the standard. As we're talking about ISO 9001, you may also be familiar with 14001, the environmental standard, or 27001, the IT standard, information technology, or 55001, and so on. These are all adopting this same structure. 22301 is the business continuity, and then 45001 is the replacement for ISO 18000 that you're currently probably familiar with. So this is the structure. This is the standard, consistent structure that you'll find throughout all management system standards. So you'll see an introduction, scope, normative references, this section 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in every standard. Now this is a copy of the table of contents from the ISO 27001, 2013. And you'll notice when you look at it, it looks exactly like the table of contents from ISO 9001, 2015. So that's what I mean when I say there's a standard structure. There's the same elements from standard to standard. So where the differences come in are the technical differences, the specific standard requirements that relate to the subject matter. So there are quality-specific requirements that you'll find throughout the standard. In the environmental standard, you'll find specific requirements that address the environmental aspects of the standards. This is just a generic framework, and it's really expected to give you that outline as you structure your system. But some of the requirements of different sectors will be very prescriptive, and they'll be added and embellished upon and expanded upon within your system. In some sectors, the basic terminology may not be appropriate. Clause emphasis is going to vary from sector to sector. So these are the 10 elements of the standard. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. So if you think about how the standard is put together and structured, there's really sections 4, 5, 6, and 7 are put together in what I would consider the planning steps. So the context of your organization as you think about setting yourself up, the leadership and how things are managed, planning your management system and your objectives, and then thinking about the support that you'll need to set that up. Operations section 8 would be the do in the plan, do, check, act cycle. And then section 9, performance and evaluation, is where you would check your management system outputs and results against what your plans were. Section 10 is the act. This is where you're going to take action on your system to make improvements or changes over time. So let's talk about some of these new buzzwords, some of the new technology terms and terminology. In the current 9001-2008 standard is only the term products, whereas in the new standard it references both products and services. Currently, we have documented procedures or records, and in the 9001-2015, that term has been replaced with documented information. The work environment has been replaced by the term environment for the operation of processes. And as I mentioned earlier, purchasing has been replaced with externally provided goods and services. Supplier is now referenced as an external provider. So if you think about documented information and the form that documented information might take, you might have, for example, training videos that you use to train your employees, or HASCOM training that you do annually with all of your employees is an example of some documented information. The key here is, how do you control that information? And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail going forward. So what is the context of the organization? It's really required for you to think about what is your operating environment. So for example, are you in the electronics industry, or the fabric industry, or the travel industry? So it's trying to get you to consider your suppliers, your customers, what are the regulatory requirements that apply to you, and think about both the internal and external factors. Internal factors might be the goods and services that you provide, your policies, regulatory requirements, your assets, information system and tools, people. Whereas external influences might be political, economical, social, technology constraints. Examples of interested parties might be your customers, the end users of your product, owners or shareholders of the company, employees, suppliers, society at large, for example. Everybody wants us to be a good corporate citizen, pay our taxes, provide a safe working environment for our employees. So that would be addressing the interested parties. And these are things that as a company you need to be thinking about as you're setting up your management system. The term exclusions has gone away. It has now been replaced with what is called not applicable. Basically, it doesn't apply to your management system based on what you do. You can't just decide something applies or doesn't apply. If you do it, it applies to what you do. If it's something that you don't, if you don't do design, then that section of the standard is not applicable to you. So it's a little bit different to exclusions in that the problem with the exclusion approach is that companies were trying to exclude some of the processes that they did, but didn't want to scope into their registration. They wanted to restrict what was actually certified as part of the organization. And the standard isn't set up to do that. It really wants you to think about the entire organization. Companies have struggled with how to define processes in their organization. So now there's actually a definition. What is a process? A set of interrelated activities that transform inputs into outputs. And it also says that your documented information considers the process approach. So how would you do that? Some examples of ways that you might have documented information that addresses the process approach might be your process maps or your turtle diagrams. You might have documented procedures still, flow charts, whatever means that you choose that best applies to your organization. Leadership. This kind of goes back to Section 5 in the current standard. The idea here is that quality managers are no longer the shield that's held out there and managing things by themselves. So as an auditor, we're going to be looking for the involvement of and understanding by top management of the management system and its effectiveness. So auditors are going to want to spend more time with your management team and understand their involvement in how they understand the effectiveness of the management system, how these business objectives that have been developed tie with the management system. It's really not intended that one person is now the management rep that handles the standard. In fact, the term management representative has actually gone away. Section 6 is the risk section of the standard, risk-based thinking. Risk has always been implied in the standards, but now it's actually explicitly called out. And it's something that you need to think about as a company and determine what risks apply to your company. The standard doesn't define what your risks are. It's really intended to drive this proactive behavior. You are not required to have a formal risk register. However, many companies will have one. It's probably the easiest approach towards identifying your risks and managing and mitigating those risks, but that's not the only singular approach that has to be taken. And again, I mentioned earlier that preventive action has gone away. That's because now you're basically developing a system that focuses on prevention, and in doing so, the risk itself addresses that preventive action, so it takes the place of it. There are new requirements in the standard to manage change. So if you think about, you've got that employee, for example, in your company that has all of that tribal knowledge. If they left and won the lottery tomorrow and took all of that knowledge with them, it would be very problematic for your company. That's something where you want to think about, how do you manage that information and how do you manage change that might come about in your management system in ensuring that that information doesn't get lost. So when you're thinking about risk, you're not expected to come up with every single possible risk that could ever occur. Really, you want to think about what are the risks that are most likely to occur or have huge consequences if they do occur. So if, for example, a company doubles their orders with you tomorrow, what is the likelihood that that's going to occur? Probably not high, but what are the consequences of it occurring? If it does occur, that might be a higher risk for you than, for example, the likelihood that there's going to be an earthquake where your company is located. Very low likelihood of occurrence. Consequences of it occurring are probably not as high. So as you're thinking about risk, you want to think about both the likelihood that something is going to happen as well as the consequences, not just think in terms in isolation of just the consequences themselves. Typically, a tool that companies might use to demonstrate this would be a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and so forth. And then FMEAs is another example where you're looking at the risks, the inputs and outputs. Risk is salted throughout the standard. You'll find it in each one of the sections 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10. So in section 4, you're required to determine the risks that can affect your ability to meet your objectives. In section 5, top management is required to ensure that section 4 is followed, that clause 4 is followed. Section 6 is where you're identifying those risks and opportunities, and then understanding that your processes identify and address the risk throughout your organization. And then as you monitor, measure, and analyze your processes, you want to evaluate the risks throughout your processes and feed that information back into changes that you make for your process. So that's in section 10. So documented information, what happened to procedures and records and manuals? The standard no longer explicitly requires you to have a quality manual, quality procedures, or specifically addressing the word records. Having said that, it still does require you to have this documented information. So it's really trying to provide a foundation for your management system. It's always been a requirement in the past. Now you need to think about, you have flexibility for the medium that you use. For example, I mentioned earlier that you might have a training video. That might be documented information that you use to train your employees. It's no longer required that you keep things in terms of procedures and records only. So I mentioned the management representative requirement has gone away. It's replaced by, exclusions has gone away, and now it's replaced by this concept of identifying those things that apply to your company. If you think about organizational knowledge, think about tribal knowledge, think about the things that people know, and you want to think about from a business continuity standpoint how you're going to ensure that that information is passed on throughout the organization. And when you think about planning, it changes. This has got some new requirements in it. It's not just changes within your documents and procedures, but also changes that you make in your process and thinking about plans that you're going to have to make and change to accomplish your objectives. And objectives should be specific. They should reference who's doing something, what's being done, when it's being done, etc. Some of the old terminology, quality policy, is still there. It's now not only is it required to be established, but it's also important that it's communicated, and we'll test that as an auditor. We'll be talking to different levels of employees throughout the organization to understand if there's been a quality policy communicated throughout the organization. The quality manual requirement has been dropped. Now, you may decide it's still a useful tool for you, and you might maintain it. However, it's no longer explicitly required. It may be a customer requirement for you, though, so you definitely want to be given that some serious consideration before you drop it. So let's talk about some of the transition timelines. The standard was published on September 15th, 2015. It started a 3-year transition period that ends on September 15th, 2018. So certificates to the ISO 9001-2008 standard won't be valid after that September 15th, 2018 date. As you think about transition, use 2015 and 2016 as the time you become aware of what the requirements are and how they impact your system. And then 2016 and 2017 are where typically you're going to be revising your system, we're going to be performing the audits, and then transition needs to be completed by, as I mentioned, 2018. We're encouraging companies to transition early. So how is NSAI giving you support in this arena? From an awareness standpoint, this webinar would be an example. We've also put together a checklist that you can use to help you in that transition. You're going to then revise your system. Now, we're going to conduct the gap audit or the transition audit during your routine surveillance or reassessment audit. We'll add a little bit of time to allow us to audit that transition activity, but it's done during your normal cycle. The transition then gets completed and we'll issue a new certificate. So when you think about this is kind of a daunting task, right? Where do you begin? How do you start this planning? You want to think about what are the internal and external issues that are relevant to your company, understand who your interested parties are, and then based on these issues, what are some of the risks and opportunities, the needs of interested parties, and then review and revise your scope of the management system and evaluate how your documented information will be controlled. During your audits, we're going to issue Category 3 findings that are specific to the 2015 standard, and that gives you kind of a laundry list of things to go off and fix. We're asking companies to make sure that your transition audit is completed no later than June of 2018 to allow time for you to close nonconformities and NSAI to make the certification decision. Now I'm going to take some time and get into the meat and potatoes of the standard and give you a detailed review, clause by clause, that gives you some of the things that have changed in the standard in more detail. As I mentioned earlier, this 10-clause structure is really set up to align back to this Plan, Do, Check, Act concept. So sections 4, 5, 6, and 7 are really tied in with the planning concept, whereas 8 is the do, 9 is check, and 10 is act. So if you get into section 4, the context of the organization, in 4.1, you're going to determine what are the relevant internal and external issues are that are relating to your strategic direction. Next, you're going to think about who are the interested parties and what are their requirements. So who are the interested parties? As I mentioned earlier, it might be your customers, your employees, your suppliers, your local community that you are in as a company, the industry that you operate in. All of those things are different opportunities for identifying interested parties. Then you want to think about the scope of your management system, and you want to make sure that you've thought about those internal and external issues, you've addressed the requirements of the relevant interested parties. The products and services covered need to be stated in your scope, and where any justification needs to be provided where any requirement can't be applied. In the past, this was thought about as an exclusion. Now it's whether or not it applies to you, and that's addressed in section 4.4. Section 5 is the leadership section of the standard, and this is where the standard is looking for management, senior management, to really be involved in understanding the effectiveness of the management system, not just relegate it off to the quality group or some other department to manage, but understanding how the quality policy and the objectives are compatible with the strategic direction of the company and how they integrate and how the effectiveness is measured. Ensuring that it's really integrating the QMS requirements into the business processes. You want to promote the use of the process approach and risk-based thinking and ensure that your QMS is achieving intended results. You want to engage, direct, support people that are contributing to the effectiveness of the management system and supporting relevant management roles. Top management needs to also be tied into the customer satisfaction aspects of the company through understanding the regulatory and statutory requirements, the risks and opportunities being identified and addressed, focusing on the products and services meeting customers and other requirements. Again, similar to the current standard, there's a requirement to develop and apply your quality policy. There's now an explicit requirement for the relevant roles to be communicated, understood, and assigned throughout the organization. And although there's not a specific requirement now for a management representative, it's more important that you're defining who has the responsibility and authority for ensuring that those processes are delivering their intended outputs. In the planning aspects of the standard, Section 1 talks about identifying those risks and opportunities. And this is where you need to think about not just identifying those risks, but what are the actions that you're going to take, and then how do those actions mitigate the risk? How effective are they at mitigating the risks that you've identified? In the objectives and planning, you want to think about how your objectives are both in line with customer requirements, in line with your product and services conformity, and then relevant to your QMS, monitored, communicated throughout the organization, and then updated. 6.3 is the changes, as we had talked about earlier. Changes need to be carried out in a planned manner, and it's now thinking about changes not just as changes to procedures, but really changes addressed as part of the planning and implementing your management system, as part of the organizational knowledge and understanding, part of understanding the needs and trends for organizational knowledge. In Section 8, the operational controls, changes that you put in place and changes to your processes to operate your business. And then changes that would be made that will affect your products and services. So all of these different aspects, although change is called out in 6.3, it's also touched upon in these other paragraphs of the standards. So there's that process interrelated approach. Section 7 is the support. This really ties back to the resources and infrastructure that we used to have in Standard 2008. So 7.1 is talking about resources. That's going to be your internal resources, your employees, the equipment that you use, your external providers, the people and the employees, and also the organizational knowledge that you need to ensure that you're providing processes and products and services that meet your customer requirements. And what external communication is needed to do that. 7.3 and 7.4 is talking about the awareness and communication and understanding both internally and externally awareness of that management system and then the benefits of improving performance. 7.5, this is where it used to require a quality manual. It's been enhanced now and it's more flexible so that you can have documented information that's needed to manage your quality management system. There's now an enhanced requirement for creating and updating documented information, and it explicitly addresses confidentiality, integrity, and then access. So if you think about what is important here, it's really knowledge management. Section 8 of the standard starts to get into the operations, and Section 8 is actually the biggest section of the standard. So it blows out into all of these different aspects of operational controls. This used to be the product realization section of the standard. One of the big changes here is the concept of purchasing changing to being externally provided goods and services. Beyond that, though, this section is really not significantly different than what you find in Section 7 today. So 8.1 is the criteria for your processes, and now considerations should be linked to customer communication, customer property, contingency actions, and then determining what the requirements are. You need a process to do that with an explicit thought about when you substantiate claims for your products and services, how do you substantiate that when you make claims about your products and what you build and what you produce? Section 8.3 ties back to the 7.3 as today, design. This has been simplified a bit. It's now allowing a much more process-oriented approach, and it considers the involvement of customers as part of your design inputs and planning to be considered. So there's explicit requirements now for considering the resource needs, and then it also goes into the review, verification, and validation in more detail than it has in the past. 8.4 kind of takes the place of 7.4 today, which is purchasing. It's now turned into control of externally provided processes and products and services. So the term supplier has gone away and been replaced with external provider. And it's really intended to have you think about the extent of control that you need to have in place to manage your external providers. And in the current standard, there's actually just a footnote in Section 4.1 that talks about outsourced processes, but this was really expanded upon in 8.4 here. So it's much more detailed and explicit what the requirements are. 8.5 is talking about the monitoring and measuring activities within your controlling of the processes, and then acceptance criteria being in place for your products and services throughout the manufacturing process or the build process or the service development process. Having the use of suitable infrastructure and the right environment for operating in. So if you build a product that requires a clean room, for example, that you have that clean room environment available, and that you have suitable monitoring and measuring resources, the tools that you require, the environment that you require, as well as the people that are required to conduct that measuring and monitoring. 8.5.2 now focuses on identification and traceability on outputs rather than product. So an output may be an intermediate product as you go through your processes, or it may be your final finished goods product. Customer property has been expanded now to think about external providers. So when you have outsourced some of your processes and those processes now use the property of some of those external providers, you need to think about how you're addressing that property into your system. Similar, now preservation of product has been changed to preservation of the output. Post-delivery activities is a new clause. And there's a requirement for controlling changes. We talked about it in the slide introducing the concept of change previously. 8.6 talks about the release of products and services, and now it's part of the operational requirements. And then control of nonconforming output is more explicit. So we used to have control of nonconforming product. Now it addresses it as nonconforming output. And it keeps it into the operational section as opposed to separating it out as its own section. Section 9 is the monitoring and the performance evaluation. So in Section 8.1, you used to have in 9001, 2008, the requirement just for planning. But now it's replaced by identifying what needs for monitoring, measuring you have, and then what methods to be used to accomplish those methods. There's specific requirements for analysis and evaluation and using the results as an input to the management review. There's effective communication of planning and actions to reduce risks and opportunities. Internal audits is now in Section 9. Not a lot of changes there, with the exception of this concept of impartiality. In the past, it said an auditor can't audit their own work. But now it's expanding how your thought process should be here and thinking about, can the auditor be impartial when they're doing the audit? So an example here might be you might have an auditor who moved out of a particular process in your organization to become an auditor, and if they're auditing a process that they used to work in, are they able to be impartial when they're doing an audit of that section? There's also now some additional requirements when it comes to the management review. So it's now looking at how the management review is addressing strategic direction, internal and external issues, external providers and what their performance is, and then again, the adequacy of resources and then the effectiveness of actions taken, but also to expand that to address risks and opportunities. And it's important that management review is aligned to the strategic direction and that management review outputs really address some of the new focus areas of the standard. Excuse me. Section 10 is really an output of the risk assessment. So 10.1, this clause is new. It's really talking about the comprehensive opportunities for improvement, but not just continual improvement. The different products and services, and then the future needs and expectations that would apply to you. So there's emphasis now on improving your processes to prevent nonconformities and improve your products and services. 10.2, this is really addressing the entire QMS, so no longer just nonconforming product or nonconforming output, but it's also thinking about nonconformity as it relates to your entire management system. There's new emphasis placed on the corrective action and how it addresses whether something is a similar, if there's an opportunity for a similar nonconformity to occur elsewhere in your system. And then again, as you have nonconformities, that you've identified how that impacts your risks and opportunities and where you're going to need to update things to address those new risks and opportunities. Documented information is now required on the nature of nonconformities. This isn't any different. Today you have to have corrective actions, a procedure, and then you're going to have outputs. This is very similar here where you'll have documented information. So to kind of wrap up here, the intent of the new standard is to give you a proactive, you're probably already meeting many of the requirements of the new standards as good business practices. You can no longer treat quality or environmental evaluation as tick-in-the-box type of exercises. It's really more about process-based systems and activities that are driven by risks and controlled by continual improvement and effectiveness. There's an increased requirement for aligning the management system that'll help make implementation of more than one management system across the board easier and more effective. So don't wait. You want to begin identifying where your gaps are today and start planning what necessary changes you'll have and implement those changes as soon as possible. You want to think about your organizational context, greater emphasis on processes, aligning your QMS with your strategic direction, and then again, this concept of integrating the QMS into your business processes. You want to determine your risks and opportunities, and then think about how, when you address those risks, you're increasing the effectiveness of your organization's QMS. Again, change management has been expanded to add emphasis that the QMS should be carried out in a planned manner. And this concept of organizational knowledge is new. It was introduced to ensure that you acquire and maintain the necessary knowledge to maintain continuity of business. And then communication is expanded to include external communication as well. So NSAI is this checklist put together that you can use as a tool. It is certainly not a mandatory requirement that you complete this, but you can use this, for example, as you go through the standard. These are the different aspects that would require QMS documentation, and then you might use this to identify what processes does this address in your system, and then what are the reference documents or procedures or records numbers that apply to each of those and then you can make comments. And then you can actually present this to the NSAI auditor, and they can use it as a tool to doing that transition audit. So that's it. I'd like to thank you for your attention and for time going through this webinar. If you have any questions, as I mentioned earlier, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. Please send me an email, lisa.greenleaf@nsaiinc.com. Again, that's lisa.greenleaf@nsaiinc.com. You can also reach me at the office, 603-882-4412. Hope you have a great day, and I hope that you've enjoyed this webinar and found it helpful to your transition. And good luck to you all.